welcome to the Skeptic Track at DragonCon 2024. Thank you so much for joining us. So we've been talking all day about a lot of the things we're going to cover again tonight, but I'd hope we could kind of do a Skepticism 101. Now, we're talking specifically, of course, about the scientific skepticism, not philosophical skepticism, because then we can really get into the weeds. But specifically with regard to scientific skepticism, why is it even important? Curt?
Wow, that's a really big question and a lot of answer to that. But I think fundamentally we take it down. It teaches us how to properly, or more properly, maybe not properly, but more properly think and navigate how we engage with information. And it's just, we have more access to information today than any time in our lives, and so there's more good that can come from that, and there's more negative things that can come from that. And so how we engage with information is vitally important, and skepticism is a way to kind of learn to engage with information and try to find, as many people have said, as many true things as you can, and discover as many things that are not true, and avoid having false belief or hope in those things.
Jamy, obviously you want to say something.
Yeah, so I mean, there's many kinds of information in the world, and skepticism is concerned with some of it. So I think skepticism from its initiation has been specifically concerned with the nature of evidence and how you decide what is true in the testable sense. There are truths, there are things we may regard as true that we can't test. And we use that word true in a different context. But scientific method is about determining testable truths. And skepticism has always been about that, about distinguishing and determining what's true in a testable way. And as part and parcel of learning what that is and how to figure that out is the nature of critical thinking and rational inquiry. These are the pillars of the skeptic movement, the modern skeptic movement. Critical thinking, rational inquiry, the nature of evidence. And the important thing about the skeptic movement is that we have never been interested or focused on, and I think we should not be focused on, telling people what to think. But rather we are trying to present people with the tools of how to think and how to think better. And ultimately that brings us around to the promotion of the scientific method as a worldview, as a way of figuring out testable truths. And I think those have been the defining pillars of the skeptic movement in the modern age.
Celestia?
Well, I have a much less academic way to explain it, and I think the best description I heard of skepticism, modern skepticism, what we do, is it's a crossroads between consumer advocacy and science education, public science education. Because critical thinking is absolutely the best tool we have to survive as individuals and as a species. And there's a frightening lack of it. And there's a lot of things that pass for it. Like every conspiracist out there believes themselves to be a critical thinker.
Yep.
And along with that, there's a lot of external good that skepticism does, but I believe it's also an internal self-help thing. It can keep you from believing your intuition. It can make you more aware of how to process things. It can make you humble. People think skeptics are know-it-alls, but every real skeptic I know is incredibly humble because we know how easy it is for human beings to be fooled. And who is it that said the easiest person to fool is you? Was
Richard Feynman.
Richard Feynman, yeah. And I don't think we realize. I'm Celestia. Hi, everybody.
Sorry, this is Celestia Ward.
Yeah, I'm not Forrest.
Yeah.
I'm the spare wheel that jumped in. Celestia Ward. I host a skeptical podcast, Squaring the Strange. I don't know if Jamy needs an introduction, but you know.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We just had a panel with everybody. So Curt Anderson and Jamy Swiss are illusionists and have written, Jamie's written a bunch of books, and Curt's getting his PhD in deception, and we've talked about all that. But Celestia, you also have a PR background that skepticism is sorely needing, because we have we've given ourselves a black eye on more than one occasion.
Yeah, I during the pandemic, I fell back on a previous skill set that I'd gone to college to attain. So yay, I'm using my degree. In the past 4 years, I have really gotten a backstage view of how media works. And a lot of the times it doesn't. Hedge funds have bought up a bunch of news outlets, and the newsrooms are staffed with a skeleton crew of what used to be there. And oftentimes what is broadcast as news is a business's press release, or a police department's press release, or a charlatan's press release. And it is just passed along uncritically. And I have maintained for years on the podcast that every newsroom should have a folklorist on staff, because plenty of times there are rumors, and rumors that are clearly repeating a trope that has been happening in folklore over and over and over again, that never get identified as a common trope. That's just, oh, there's this brand new thing happening, blah, 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 you know. So,
yeah.
And it also used to be the major news outlets always had, I'm talking about newspapers now, always had science staff, science reporters, reporters who were specialized in reporting on science, and that is almost non-existent today.
yes, yeah.
But I want to pick up on your point and just to support it, to say that consumer advocacy has been a part of the skeptical movement from day one. And the initial consumer advocacy side of skepticism was about debunking psychics, right? And because what you're doing is you're providing consumer protection by helping people to learn to identify con artists and help people prevent themselves becoming victims of con artists. And professional con artistry is a common part of the human condition, and it has not gone away. Con artists use timeless techniques, ancient techniques that have been long refined and developed, and they adapt to current situations. They adapt to technology. Our friend Bob Nygaard, who's been here in the past, who is probably America's #1 psychic investigator, not from the science side, but he's a PI, retired cop, lives in Florida, and he helps people who have been victimized by professional psychics, and he helps them not only gain restitution, but he helps build criminal cases, because he's an ex-cop. He understands that system, and he's gotten better and better over the years at pushing police and prosecutors to actually file cases and put psychics in jail. And the presence of these, people think this is a minor thing. It's not a minor thing.
Billions of dollars.
Yeah. I mean, and especially the elderly are targeted and victimized. But there are others. There's a story just recently about having nothing to do with the psychic side of things, of just a banking scam, an old banking scam that's now, they're just more efficient because they can use computers to dial phone numbers, and they get phone lists and so on and so forth. And, people who press a button and give away millions of dollars and give away their life savings. So anyway, so that aspect of explaining con artistry and trying to protect people has always been fundamentally a part of the skeptic movement since the start.
Well, I'm a practicing emergency physician, and my particular passion topic is alternative medicine, because if it worked, it'd be called medicine, right? So, but people actually die from using or not using actual medicine.
Yeah.
And so patient protection is a big motivator for me. So.
I was going to say, so in my academic endeavors, I am presently working on my PhD in communication studies with a specialization in deception. And one of the things that we're really realizing in the last 15 years is that we are not fundamentally good at or designed to spot deception. It's evolutionary functional to accept things as we see them until something triggers us to believe that it could be false. Imagine, if you would, that every piece of information you received every day, you questioned. You would get nothing done. It's been more important for survival that we work together. And so it's easier to work together if you accept things as true. When Angie introduced me and said, "This is Curt Anderson," and my name came up here, if you've never seen me before, your first thought probably wasn't, "Well, he doesn't look like a Curt Anderson. Why would they say that? I don't think he's really Curt Anderson." We just don't do that. We accept that. There's very rarely a time in our lives where, like, not accepting somebody's name as they say it would make a difference, so we just accept that. And there's even a little bit of a chance you could be triggered because you know I'm a magician, so it might be a stage name, but it's still just not a natural thing to do. And as it turns out, almost everything that we take in information-wise, our default position is to just accept it as true unless we are triggered. And one of the things that Jamy talked about in a prior panel today is that you can be highly tuned to be skeptical in the field that you're in because that trigger level is much more active because you spot something. If somebody comes in with a medical condition, Angie goes, "Oh no, I know that's not what you think it is because I've seen this 1,000 times." I would have no clue. Somebody tells me, "Oh, well, I think I've got whatever illness," I just like, okay, because it's not. So even you can be very skeptical and be very rational in your decisions in one point and be totally blind in another. So it's a constant. You have to work at being skeptical, and we don't naturally like to work at things. So
what you're saying is skeptics are exceptional human beings who work really hard. We're like the super tasters of information.
some of them,
Well, what
not
about
all.
Well, I think it's an important point there where you're talking about what makes skeptics different or if they stand out or whatever. And I always remind people that the reason it's easy for people to make mistakes is that we are not programmed. We did not evolve as critical thinkers. Critical thinking is not always going to help you when you are a social animal in the African plains trying to hunt animals much larger than yourself. And now you have to hunt cooperatively. But you're also faced with dangers, so if you hear a sound that on the one hand might be the sound of a dangerous animal, or on the other hand might just be a rustling of the breeze, it's actually in your favor to assume the former. Because if you make a mistake on the former, assuming the former, there's not a big consequence. If you make a mistake assuming the latter, you could be somebody's lunch. So all of these, well, we always hear this term, cognitive biases, like how we resolve cognitive dissonance, for example, is a cognitive bias that all of us are subject to, and it's almost impossible for us to overcome it.
Hey, Jamy, we're 101, and those are really familiar terms for us. Could you give us a brief description of what cognitive bias and cognitive dissonance is?
Well, so cognitive bias there's a long list of cognitive biases, ways that we are subject to thinking that prevent us from thinking accurately when we are. So confirmation bias, for example, is one of the most common. It gets talked about all the time, which is, skeptics make the mistake of thinking that people who believe in things that are wrong don't have evidence. This is one of the biggest mistakes that skeptics make all the time. They think we have evidence, those guys don't have evidence. That's not true. People who believe in the most outrageously wrong, non-existent things, they always believe they have evidence. It's just lousy evidence. And this is why I say about skepticism having to do with what is the nature of testable claims or what is the nature of good evidence. That's the difference between us and people who believe in pseudoscientific beliefs, because what they regard as evidence is actually not good quality evidence. So people will believe and they will select information. Well, there's this story, there's this article, there's this source, there's this witness, and they select information that confirms their pre-existing belief. That's confirmation bias. People do it all the time. Cognitive dissonance has to do with if you are faced with a belief contrary to, if you are faced with facts contrary to your own belief, depending on how committed you are to the belief, you may just dismiss the facts. And not only will you dismiss the facts, but in order to resolve the dissonance, the discomfort that you feel between your belief and the evidence that just happened before you, you will double down on your belief.
And
Okay?
rationalize it.
And you will rationalize
And
it.
intelligent people are really good at that.
Yes, absolutely. But this is what's, and oh, by the way, a wonderful book about this that I can't recommend highly enough to you is called, a highly readable, delightful book, revelatory book, is called Mistakes Were Made But Not by Me, by
Carol Tavris.
my dear friend Carol Tavris. And it's a book about cognitive dissonance. And you can't read 3 pages of this book without recognizing either someone you know or yourself.
Yep.
So these things are programmed into us evolutionarily, and they are very difficult to overcome because, like everything else, like the scientific revolution, learning the advantages of overcoming these things is a recent phenomenon. It's a blink of the eye in evolutionary time, and we can't unwire ourselves. There's a book I read in the 90s, I think, called Uncommon Sense by Fromer, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's out of print, unfortunately. But it talks about the fact that critical thinking, rational inquiry, the scientific method is not a natural way for human beings to think. It's just, it doesn't feel right. It's not how we think. We are programmed to make quick conclusions about cause and effect, right? And about finding patterns. We are pattern-seeking animals in countless ways. It's why we, when we're kids, we see faces in clouds, and that's harmless, that's imagination, but you have to learn to distinguish as an adult between imagination and reality. I personally believe the older I get, that the fundamental challenge to every human being when you open your eyes in the morning on that day and every day thereafter is trying to determine the difference between confluence and causality.
Yeah.
I think this is the fundamental problem of human existence, quite simply. So the scientific method, basically, briefly, you have to learn to overcome your instinct, right?
Yeah.
As anecdote, and put that aside and take as authority something that you did not figure out yourself, that experts figured out, that scientists ran double-blind experiments over and over and over again and published them in reviewed journals and reached a conclusion that you now embrace. And that is the version of reality I embrace. And that's how I, look for the moment I have a doctor, if I go to a specialist doctor, and even though they are completely qualified in every way, but they offer me, in some soft sense, they offer me some, well, there's an alternative thing, you could take this supplement or whatever. Thanks, have a nice day, have a nice life. Cross you off my list. I'm not going back to that office.
Look who has emerged.
Yes, indeed.
Through the trees.
Thank you so
agree with
much.
everything he said.
Indeed.
I came here to chime in that he is absolutely right about everything that I just missed. Totally.
So, Forrest, what's
And
your
that
favorite?
means we will let you stay.
Oh, yes, thank
So,
you.
Forrest, what is your favorite bias, and why is it confirmation?
Cognitive bias.
Yeah, honestly, I love the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
Oh, that's a good one.
I love when people just throw spaghetti at the wall, and then when things work, they're like, well, that's what I meant to do. That's exactly what it was supposed to be, exactly. And I see that a lot whenever people are arguing about, be it a science thing or a theistic thing or whatever. It's just like, this is the one time when this worked, and therefore all the other things are wrong. And yes, it is confirmation bias, always. Yes, that's how it always is.
We already did
Yep.
introductions. Can
Yeah, I'm
you-
sorry, I was about to say.
Yeah, no, I
Please.
apologize for being late. Uber apparently didn't realize that there was a lot of traffic around this area for some reason, and so a 15-minute drive turned into a 40-minute drive. But hi, my name's Forrest Valkai. I'm a biologist and a science communicator, and I'm here because of this guy right here. So blame him when this goes weirdly.
I'll take that chance.
That's right.
My favorite bias is anchoring bias because it was the first one I heard about.
Okay.
Congratulations if you got that. But
No more calls, please. We have a winner.
Excellent, excellent.
But I recently
Explain yourself, please.
I
Took me
recently
like
this
a
is
full 3 count and then just kicked my ass.
Now, I recently, this is Skepticism 101, and I recently got to explain skepticism to a group of 11 and 12-year-olds at a big leadership summer camp. And what I did, because I'm a cartoonist, is I drew up, you've seen Inside Out. In fact, you may have seen some characters from Inside Out walking around out there, the Pixar movie. And instead of making emotions, I illustrated a few common cognitive biases. And I did confirmation bias, and they've got a big bowl of cherries, and they're picking cherries. Because that's what you do with confirmation bias. You only look for the facts that suit you, you know. And I did anchoring bias. He had a big anchor on his, arm. And we talked about these. And it was wonderful seeing these kids their eyes were just opening with stuff, and they knew so much more than I thought they would. They impressed me so much. I brought up Carl Sagan, and we talked about stuff like that, and some of these kids were familiar with it.
Maybe there's hope.
Yeah, I was very pleased with this group of tweens and teenagers. And the oh gosh, there was a story I brought, because of course camp is about getting to know each other and singing Kumbaya, literally singing Kumbaya around a campfire. And so I had a huge group of kids with different backgrounds, and I said, who here has a family recipe, like a trick remedy to get rid of a cold? And everybody raised their hand. I said, okay, tell me what it is. Somebody was a hot, super, super spicy Filipino soup. You take a really, really, really hot shower. And they all had these different remedies. And I said, how many of you guys think they work? They all thought they worked. And I said, well, the thing about a cold is after a few days, or when you get older, a few weeks, but when you're young and healthy, after a few days, the cold goes away. And if you happened to put onions in your socks the night before the cold goes away, you wake up, you feel better, you're like, those onions did the trick. So that's confirmation bias, or that's post hoc ergo propter hoc.
Yeah.
My cold went away after I put onions in my socks, therefore, my family remedy of onions in the socks really works. And from there I started talking about, I said, now there was I wouldn't call it a family remedy, but there was a guy who decided that a little bit of duck liver would cure a cold. Does anybody think that's plausible? And the kids are all like, I don't know about that. And I'm like, well, he didn't just give them like duck liver to eat on a plate. He took a tiny little bit of duck liver and swished it around in like a gallon of water. And then he dumped all the water out. And then he took a little bit of the water from that thing, put a drop in, swished it around with another gallon of water, and then dumped it out, and proceeded to do this 50 times. And what he had left, and the kids are like, there'd be nothing left. I'm like,
Yes.
I like what you're putting down there. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Avogadro's numbers.
And then they just took the rest of the water after 50 times of this, and they put some of the water into a little sugar pill, and they said it would cure your cold. And the kids are like, oh. And I'm like, well, what would you say if I told you could go back into town and buy that for $20 at the CVS or the Walmart?
Mm-hmm.
And you'd have thought I slapped them all across the face with a fish. When I told them that was the definition of homeopathy, I think I created about 35 skeptics in 5 minutes.
That's great.
Excellent. Yep.
That's the dangerous thing about homeopathic medicine, is that you can die of an overdose if you just forget to take it.
Oh my God. So you got here a little late, but we
Yes.
love you anyway. So,
I was pedaling with both feet. I was trying.
That's okay. That's okay. So so as a biology background person, you understand that the brain fails.
Yeah.
The brain fails. Can you talk about optical illusions and brain failure and things like that?
Yeah, the whole thing. Like this is a lot of your purview as well. It's just like making people think they saw something that they think they saw. And like, you can do these, if you're talking about with little kids, a great lesson you can do, you can make a big U with your fingers here, close one eye and look across at the top of the other finger, and just kind of wiggle this finger, move it back and forth. You'll find a spot right about there where the tip of this finger will disappear. You have this blind spot in the back of your eye because of where the optic nerve connects. And some other things that are really bad design in our bodies. But you have this big blind spot in your eye, and so your brain is constantly just filling in this gap so that you don't see these two big dark spots here in your vision all the time. And there are a million things like that, things that your body, your brain really just takes for granted, things that you fill in that aren't really there. Things when you think you hear something, things when you think you see something, little tiny hallucinations that people can have, especially in situations of stress. So if you have somebody who's emotionally compromised, somebody who's maybe perhaps grieving, and then has one of these little illusions, these auditory illusions that your brain does all the time that just kind of happens to sound like their lost relative, well, now all of a sudden you've got somebody who believes in ghosts. And that's something that I've encountered, I can't even tell you how many times.
Yeah, that happened to my mother.
Yeah, and so like there's a million and one ways that your brain is messing with you all the time. And if you ever want to explore it, optical illusions are a great way to do it. Looking at if you ever see a grid pattern, you're gonna see little dots in that grid that aren't really there because your brain is just really good at saying, that's a lot of data. It kind of looks like this. It's fine. It just looks like that. And you know it's wrong, but your brain just fills in the blanks. And so people like Curt can make a whole living out of that, of just like using people's biases and their assumptions that their brain is making that they might not even notice their brain is making in order to take them down a totally wild path. And if he were to use his powers for evil, he could then become, like a preacher and take them down a lot of paths that way,
You tried that already.
Yep.
Sorry.
Go ahead. No, please.
I mentioned earlier that skepticism at its core, if you're doing it well, it should make you humble. And in a way, there's also this profound pride of realizing we are nature's imperfect machines learning to unravel our own programming and improve ourselves. And there's a lot of psychology involved in skepticism, and it's a fascinating thing. And I don't think there's a way to learn it all and ever stop doing it.
No, it should be an ongoing process.
Yeah,
and
it is.
The first thing I remember, like when I was you mentioned psychology. The first psychology class I took in my undergrad, that was like the first lesson was the biggest bias that you're going to have to face is assuming that you know the biases, therefore you're not going to be fooled. That is the biggest one.
Isn't that called the bias?
Yeah, just like
one,
the thing that plagues academics, the thing that plagues people who are educated, the people who plague scientists of all stripes is I know this stuff, therefore I'm not going to get it wrong. You are the one that I am the most worried about out of everybody, because if you're not double checking yourself, especially about things that you think you already know, you're gonna get taken for granted, and you're gonna make some silly ass mistakes that you would then mock somebody who was less educated for making. And especially I love that note about how it's really a practice of humility, because a lot of people in the skeptic community add in a heavy dose of arrogance to what they're doing and think that skepticism is the art of disagreeing with anybody about anything, and that the more people you piss off when you disagree, the more skeptical you are, and that there's so much more to it than that. And if you are still up on a high horse after learning just how many ways you can mess up and just how prolifically you mess up all the time, I don't know like how to get through to you at that point. That's weird.
That's fair.
Skepticism done right really should create empathy for people who have fallen for a psychic scam, or fallen for homeopathy medicine, or naturopathy, or what ND stands for not a doctor, as you say. But you can understand the pressures.
They love coffee enemas. Yeah. I just have to point that out.
TMI.
You can just drink it. You don't have to shoot it anywhere else.
I didn't come here to be judged, okay?
Now we know where you were late.
Your point about empathy is an interesting one. And probably my greatest consistent disappointment in the skeptic movement is the lack of empathy. And whenever I've given talks over the years about con artists and about phony psychics and all of those kinds of scams, I constantly run into skeptics being the first ones to blame the victim and say, and we can understand why non-skeptics would do that, right? And say, well, how could you fall for those claims? How could you give someone so much money for that, et cetera, et cetera? But if you're a skeptic, a self-described skeptic, and you are trying to serve a social function, a social value of trying to educate people and trying to protect them in that consumer protectionist way we were talking about, then the first thing you have to understand is, how does it work? How does it work? How do cognitive biases work that serve cognitive dissonances at the fundament of most con victims? And if you don't educate yourself as to how that works, then you're never going to protect someone, you're never going to inform and protect someone, if your answer is to blame the victim. And I see it all the time in social media and with even among skeptic groups, and somebody posts a story, I've done it myself, post a news story about psychic scam or something like that, and so-called skeptics come on and say, well, come on, how could you be that dumb? Oh, well, you may be a lot of things, but you're not a skeptic. Because one of the fundamental jobs that we've talked about in skepticism for forever is, part of the thing of skepticism, of being an activist skeptic, is educating yourself about all of these different dangers that come from faulty thinking. And it's endless, and no one is an expert on all of them, right? So Bob Nygaard's problem in trying to get police and prosecutors to prosecute psychic cons is to try and explain to them how it works, and that they're using, it's not cupidity or stupidity that makes people victims, it's psychological weaponry that's been refined over countless generations and used over and over and again. People are trained in the culture, in the skill set. And that's the hardest part, is explaining to cops and prosecutors and judges how that works and how to explain why it is fraud and not the victim's fault.
Yeah. So, Curt, can you talk to us about memory? Because we know that our brains do not record things like on a VCR, that they actually reconstruct what you're trying to recall.
Yeah, so it's not my area of expertise, but like most magicians, there's a lot of demonstrations with memory, and so I have worked with that some, and
well,
also.
what do you want to talk about then? Let's talk about that.
Well, I mean, it is a topic, because and Jamy mentioned this earlier. One of the worst forms of evidence in court is eyewitness testimony. Because you don't remember things the way that we think that we see something and then, oh, we remember that. But back to filling in those gaps, right? And especially when you're under stress, and this was earlier, somebody mentioned, like, the more stress, the less you remember, but you don't want to seem stupid or unaware, so your brain starts filling things in, and then you remember it that way. Or you have a situation where it was emotionally pleasing or stressful either way, and so your memories start to get better or worse. And this is a lot of why people talk about the good old days, when the good old days really weren't good. Like, I was an 80s kid, and they did some studies, and the 80s were not particularly good for like teenagers. But teenagers in the 80s all remembered as being like the best decade ever. And it really, like, objectively
Best
wasn't.
music ever.
Right? So we attribute those feelings of music, and that's still here, and so that enhances that, false memory. So again, it's not my field, but I do know there are some pretty fundamental ideas that, are scientifically based, and our memory is not.
The neuroscience of memory
very
is some area that we are really constantly and dramatically advancing on.
Yeah.
With the advancement of technology, which can also be misused and exaggerated. fMRI is a big fad, and a lot of claims are made based on fMRI, which are nonsensical, but nevertheless.
My favorite's the dead fish.
Yes, exactly, the dead fish, exactly. So, but you mentioned actually, Angie, you talked about calling up memory and changing it. So yes, so we learn increasingly now that every time you call up a memory, it's not a static recording. It's every time you call it up and refile it, you've altered it. And human memory is incredibly unreliable. And of course, the most dramatic example of this we have is the work of my friend Beth Loftus, who after the Satanic Panic period of the 90s, in which countless families were broken up and sent to prison on these outrageous claims of satanic abuse and all of this kind of stuff, and a lot of it came from so-called recovered memory, right? Which was also, recovered memory was the same mechanisms as that's the same era, more or less, as UFO abduction craze, right? And in both cases, hypnosis was implied there because you had a misuse of hypnosis by irresponsible and inadequately trained practitioners. So we skeptics were at the forefront of trying to bust that stuff at the time, but we really lacked the science. And Elizabeth Loftus, she figured out how to prove that there was such a thing as an implanted memory. That you can implant, and this has now been widely replicated and added to. So we can implant a memory under laboratory conditions, a false memory of something that never happened, and then prove that the subject cannot tell the difference between what's a false memory that was implanted artificially and what's a real memory of something they really experienced. And essentially what that does, you can't prove a negative, but essentially the proof of the existence of false memories, implanted memories, proves that recovered memory, that there's no such thing as recovered memory. And yet recovered memory is still a thing in popular culture. It's still widely believed and wildly embraced. And, you know, I actually was involved in a conference where I brought Carol Tavris and Beth Loftus to come and speak. And this was a very expensive, kind of sophisticated, I put in quotes, conference in which it was an uproar in the audience when they got to Elizabeth's taken for granted conclusions that recovered memory doesn't exist. I'll say it again, recovered memory doesn't exist. There's no such thing. And yet it is taken as an article of truth still in popular culture today.
You know, there's a magic example that so you can kind of see this in like real life, how someone can manipulate memory, and great lawyers are wonderful at this when they get people in for depositions. All right, so I'm going to take you back when I was doing restaurant magic, and I do this trick every magician that does, you know, any amount of magic has done, where you've got these little sponges. And you have one, and then you have two, and then you have three, and then in the end, you got to do something really like cool as like a big crescendo at the end of the trick. So I had this thing where I ended with 13 of these little sponges, but I always wanted to seem better, because if you say, well, you know, he had one, and then he had two, and then he had 13, like that sounds cool, right? But I would tell people I was doing the same restaurant every week. And so I would tell people as I finished, I opened my hands. So these sponges are kind of bouncy and they kind of go everywhere. So as I'm like, well, you know, I had one, I had two, I had three. How many do you think I have now? And they would always say 4. And I'd open up and I'm like, no, I actually have 100. And these things would start popping out. And I would act like I'm grabbing handfuls of these. And I was picking up like 1 or 2, stuffing them in my pockets. Sometimes not even grabbing any, stuffing them like everywhere, and talk about the 100 of balls that I'm putting away. And they would go tell their friends, oh, this guy like made 100 balls appear in front of me. And so people would come in to see, because they can't even imagine like what 100 balls on a single table would be. And the people would walk away with the memory that I turned 1 ball into 100. And it was 13. 13 and 100 are not even close to the same. But because they were in a vulnerable spot where I was manipulating and controlling the situation and implanted this idea as they were surprised, and then I'm enhancing this by acting like I'm putting 100 balls away and telling them I'm putting 100 balls away. So when you're in a situation when your brain has to fill in those gaps, the easiest way to do it is what, you know, you're being fed, and it seems reasonable. So a good lawyer can do that with a witness and say, well, like, did you see this? And if they're not sure, they're like, oh, yeah, that does make sense. Not consciously, right? But again, we're just not good at memory. So it can be easily manipulated.
I think that also plays in a lot, like that suggestion that you're talking about. If they're in that situation where they're like, they don't know what to expect, they have a prepped memory. They already, they've been kind of primed to believe a thing already. And then they have that surprise. They're looking at their friends, they're looking at you, they're looking at the table. The people count to 1, 2, 3, and a lot. So this is now in the lot category, and that's everything past 3 is a lot. And so, like, having just all these compounding factors in there, it makes total sense. And plus, it's more of an exciting thing for them to then say, which makes it more reliable for them to want to hear it. Did this actually explode, or did it just kind of open up a little bit? It's exploded. That's just way more fun to think and way more fun to believe. And so, like, there's so many factors there, not just like everything you talked about, priming it, saying it, and then just like the joy they're getting out of believing it, whether or not it's true. They could, some small part of them be like, okay, that wasn't 100. It was 100. It was 100. It was exciting. It was 100. You know what I mean?
Well,
Like,
I know what I saw.
yeah, exactly. Yes. Like, there's so much there, not just about your technique, which is important, but also the emotion that plays into it. Like, that is such a dope thing to, like, I wish I had a recording of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
And
Well-
as you learn about memory as a skeptic, just a word of advice, when you learn about how unreliable memory is for yourself and others, don't share this with your domestic partner or your spouse, or you will never win an argument ever again.
Good point, good point. So we do have a microphone here in the aisle. Don't touch it or Mark will kill you. But it would be delightful to hear what questions the audience has. Hello.
Hello. First a comment, I know that's forbidden, but something Jamy said about the scientific method, I think the reason it's so successful is skepticism's baked in. I mean, that's rule 1, it's got to be falsifiable. And so you immediately, look for how could I be wrong. But my question is for Forrest, I assume. I'm far removed from academic science books, so is that part of the curriculum? Be skeptical when you're learning science, when you're doing science. Is that?
Yeah. So like for every undergrad class that I took, like really early on, to get my first science degrees, it was like that was like the main thing was talking about hypothesis-driven science. Especially when I took psychology, talking about how fallible your brain is. The way that I teach, whenever I'm especially talking to high schoolers, is I want to make sure they know like how to spot pseudoscience, how to spot a faulty claim. I know that like at a certain, like you get to like the 3,000 level, they kind of just assume that you know this by now, but definitely like introductory courses, that's still something that's taught, at least in where I come from in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is not known for our educational value. And so like, if we're doing it, then I'm hoping other people are doing it really well too. Yeah.
So this is a question to kind of everyone at large. I was a former telephone psychic, and I'm not anymore, yay. But during that time, I learned a lot, and it actually made me the skeptic that I am today. Now, I'm working in the medical field, and I work with some wonderful humans who are starting to fall for psychic scams.
Oh.
And it doesn't matter what I say, as someone who has worked in that industry, as someone who fooled people and hates myself for it a little bit, how do I talk to people who are not as open to that? And to truly say, hey, this is a problem.
So to kind of show people how big of a problem this is, I know Jamy and I both face this, and I'm assuming you have. So you've talked to people, they say, oh, I believe in psychics. And you go, no. I used to do this. And they're like, oh, no, I'm sure, but mine's real.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's okay. I've done demonstrations in the show and say this is not real. And then people come up to me and want to pay me to interpret dreams or give a psychic reading. I'm like, it's not real. And they're like, well, I was seeing this reader, and like, no. And they're like, yeah, but mine is real. So I think Jamie's probably got the most experience with this.
So it's very difficult because it has to do with worldview. And this is another important idea for skeptics to understand in a broader sense, is we like to think, we humans, we like to think that we accumulate evidence, and then we draw conclusions, and we decide what we believe. That's a nice story. That's not true at all. Mostly, we come to conclusions, and then we talked about confirmation bias before, but to varying degrees, even people who try to be rational, try to be critical thinkers, we are still looking at the world in ways that support our beliefs and our worldview. So when Naomi, a historian of science at Harvard University, Naomi Orestes, she co-wrote a book called Merchants of Doubt. And it was about the conspiracy to conceal climate change. It was not about the science, so much the science of climate change, but the conspiracy to conceal it. And when she started to look at this, she assumed that this would all come from certain economic forces and oil companies and so on and so forth. What she found was very different. It was partly that, but what she also found was, well, first of all, that professionals were being used and engaged to create confusion and to conceal the facts. But what she really got to was that it was largely a function of worldview. So the thing for skeptics to understand about this is skeptics tend to think that, okay, if someone believes in astrology and we show you the science of astrology, which is easily tested and has been tested and disproved countless times, then someone will change their mind because evidence, right? No. And when you start to argue with or present that evidence to someone, a believer who believes in astrology, not only will they not change their mind, they get pissed off. Mm-hmm. They get angry and upset.
And more entrenched.
The reason, you're right, so the entrenched is the cognitive dissonance part, but the reason fundamentally that they get angry and upset is because their belief in astrology is just a piece, a cog in the machinery of their worldview. Okay? So when you find pseudoscience where it fits in the culture, and there are pseudoscience beliefs that come from sort of the left, if you will. I'm not trying to politicize the conversation here. And others that come from the right, but they're reflective of worldview. And the anti-vax movement came out of the left and moved to the right. Mm-hmm. And the reason it came out of the left was because of what's called the naturalistic worldview, partly. That chemicals are bad, and that, you're better off listening to your yoga instructor than you are to your medical doctor. And there's a swath of culture, of subculture, that kind of sees the world that way, right? So this is what makes it difficult to talk to this person, because the person is not going to change their mind just on the basis of evidence, just like the horoscope believer, right? They have a world outlet, a world outlook that's larger than this little case with the psychic, of how they draw conclusions about what's real and what's not. Remember I said before, it's not that they don't have evidence. She has lots of evidence. It's bad evidence. So the way to try and discuss it, and I do not say to you, I am not optimistic for you here, but the way to try to discuss it is to focus down on the little points of evidence. What makes you believe this? And this is the word falsifiable was used, right? This is key. What would change your mind? What would make you not believe in this person? And try and ask those practical questions. Well, what exactly are they doing for you? What benefit have they delivered to you? Right? To try and what you're trying to do is not just pick up the whole thing and delete it, but rather put cracks in the wall. The cracks are the most important thing skeptics can do. And sometimes the crack, well, it's an interesting subject when it comes to religion too, but we don't need to get into that aspect of it. But you're really trying to sort of say, well, okay, that's interesting, but what if? One of the problems, and finally, big problems with this kind of thing with psychic reading is they're using a combination of, skeptics misuse this term, they're using cold reading. They're partly doing cold reading, but they're actually using a combination of universal readings plus some cold reading. And the person is going to tell you, I didn't tell them anything about myself, and they told me all this stuff. Well, if they went in with a tape recorder, and I hardly talked, and now what I'm describing to you is something that's an experiment that's been done. If you run a tape recorder and then you and you analyze the tape recording afterwards, the person is doing most of the talking. The psychic is actually asking questions. The person is giving them information, and then the psychic is feeding it back in a slightly different altered form that's also diluted, so it's a little piece at a time. And then the question to ask about that, besides the fact of it, but the question to ask about that is, so they're telling you things you already know. Aren't they just telling you things you already know? So what's the value in that? And that's actually what psychics are doing, is they're telling people what they already know. It's been called the poor man's therapy, because that has to do with that person's worldview. So it's difficult, and I admire your desire to change it, and the thing is to try and go small rather than big.
I have a quick practical suggestion for that. And my co-host on Square and Strange podcast, Ben Radford, has had to talk people out of harmful beliefs like they've been cursed or their home is haunted, and an approach that does help. It might not strip them of their belief, but it can help protect them is you don't necessarily have to attack the whole belief. You can say, yeah, she might be really intuitive, and you might be getting some really good information out of her. Just know that there are, of course, frauds and people who are just out to get money, and your friend will probably say, oh, I'm sure there are some, and just say, so set a limit. The common practice is they ask you for, $50 a session or $25 for a 10-minute reading or something like that, but then they amp it up. If she ever asks you for more than $100, or if he suddenly wants $1,000, know your limit. Can you set a limit? I live in Las Vegas. This is how you keep gamblers from becoming homeless. Know your limit. Can you spend $1,000 tonight on the casino floor and afford to lose that? That's your limit. Know your limit. So if you just tell your friends to set, just promise me you'll set a limit. If she ever asks for more than X amount of dollars, think twice, or give me a phone call. Maybe we can talk about it,
And what results might you get if you spent that same amount of money and gave it to a professional therapist who's trained?
Mm-hmm.
If I can also throw in just a communication technique that's worked for me. I do a lot of call-in shows about atheism, skepticism, science, and whatnot. And one thing that really works for me, people who are really dug in to their ideas, is some old marketing language that I learned a long time ago. It's feel, felt, found. So you want to make sure that they feel heard, and that they don't feel isolated, and they don't feel attacked, and that they are learning something new with you, not by themselves. They're not embarrassed, you know what I mean? So I understand how you feel. A lot of people have also felt that same way, but we have found that this is horseshit, and this is the structure of the argument. So that you just, oh, I totally get that. I totally understand that that's really helpful for you, and I understand why that's making a big emotional connection for you. It's really helping you with your grief, with your trauma, with whatever. You want this person to feel heard and understood. And a lot of other people feel that way too. I can't tell you how many people I talk to that are going to these same psychics for the same reason. I used to do it when I was a kid. I used to maybe work in this industry. I used to do a lot of people feel this way. You're not alone. You're not stupid. You're just in a community here. But we've found, love the idea of not attacking the whole belief, we've found that you're completely wrong and dumb. We've found that these guys are a lot less effective than we used to think. They're a lot less trustworthy than we used to think. And in fact, these other techniques, like fucking doctors, work really well, a lot better than we previously assumed. And so that kind of structure to the discussion, I found has really helped a lot in getting through to people, helping them not feel so scared by the new information, helping them not be so resistant and so dug in. And it also helps them open up. And then you can start having that serious conversation, which I love, is okay, if this is so good, can you give me a list of reasons when it is good? Can you give me some times when it's worked? No? Cool, me neither, But that's just the key that I use to kind of unlock that conversation.
Yeah, I love it when they come in the emergency department. Yeah, I don't go to doctors.
Yeah.
All right, how's that working for you?
Yeah.
We figured you'd be here soon.
Yeah, indeed. So, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the first things that made me a skeptic is I used to think plane crashes were super deadly, where it's like, oh, you're less likely to get in one, but if you get in one, you're totally going to die. And then I looked more into the information and found out I was very wrong, and it made me a much more skeptical person. What was something that really pushed you into becoming a skeptic yourselves?
Good question.
That's a good one.
Nice.
All right, well, Celestia, you want to start well, sorry, yeah, I got you
No,
mid-swallowed.
good question is what you say when you got to think about it for a second.
Oh, okay.
So,
You want to start with anybody else?
Yeah, I can jump in. For me, it was when I started applying the same rules of logic and morality to my supernatural beliefs that I did to literally anything else ever, and they fell apart. And so then I decided I should probably start poking at everything a little bit harder and see what else comes apart. And that can be dangerous for some people, people who come out of really, really deep supernatural big beliefs, and they try some skepticism and that falls apart. I've noticed a pattern in my work of people can then fall into conspiracy theory thinking as well, because they're like, well, I question the creator of the universe and he disappeared, so like if I question the government too, maybe the aliens are real, and like that happens. But for me, it was just, I wanted so bad to do sciencey stuff, and I was, late teens, early 20s, still holding on some of the beliefs that my parents had taught me. And the second I started applying the same rules that I would expect to apply to anything else ever, those ideas vanished. And that made me want to do that to everything. And anything that is worth believing in would stick around. So yeah, that's just, it worked for me immediately once I tried it.
Yeah, and for me, when I started doing magic and I realized how easily we could be fooled, and I didn't really want to be, it's like magic's a good time of being fooled, but I didn't want the negative consequences of being fooled in things that were more important. So as I study deception, I tell people, if I ask you, is it all right if I deceive you? Is it okay if I lie to you? And everybody's like, no, that's terrible. But actually, deception, being fooled, is a tool. It's a communicative tool that can be used for good or bad. If you come to my show and I don't make you question reality, if I don't give you a sense of wonderment, if you don't walk out of there being like, wow, that was amazing, or at least interesting, if you went, oh, I know how he did all of that, and I don't fool you in any level, that's a bad magic show. So it's a communicative tool. Well, that idea of hey, when is it okay to allow myself to be fooled and when is it not? And there's some things that are higher stakes. And so that kind of got that ball rolling, and I applied that to everything except my religious beliefs.
Yep.
And then eventually that fell too, and then it made me question everything else. So it was a long process for me, very painful process, but yeah.
I never had an aha moment. I spoke in an earlier panel about the fact that I started magic very young when I was 7 years old, and by the time I was probably 9 or so, I was reading about Houdini, and I was not taken at first with his escapes and all of that, but rather I was very taken with the stories of him busting phony psychics. I had a kind of obsession with truth, how you determine what's true, what's not true, and that seemed a real life, like a superhero, of applying this truth-seeking missile that had profound effect on people, right? And that caught my imagination, and I think I would have been a sort of a natural skeptic, really, as long as I could remember. I never had a breakthrough idea. And I'll say very quickly here, because this is Skepticism 101. Some of you have been around the skeptic movement for a long time. Some of you may be new and coming into the room, and I'm going to give you three of my favorite books that I always give to beginning skeptics. And I already mentioned one, Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me, by Carol Tavris. This is a great read. It's a really fun read, and it will change your view of the person you see in the mirror in the morning. But also Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, which was his final book and his manifesto of skepticism and critical thinking, what he really believed and why he really believed it. It's really sort of a fundamental text. And a small book by Michael Shermer called Why People Believe Weird Things, that touches on a lot of critical thinking issues, but also cognitive biases. And these are great, useful tools for thinking about skepticism and thinking about why people make mistakes in thinking and how we can correct them.
I've also been skeptical for a very long time, and I think one of the things that kind of turned me that way is I was raised by religious parents who were not the same religion.
Wow.
So when you have a Mormon and a Catholic, get married for 5 years, you end up with 4 atheist kids.
Excellent.
Because you look at the bullshit over there and the bullshit over there, and you're like, at least one of you is wrong. Possibly both of you.
Possibly.
Yeah, both of you are wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing about atheism, is you're only difference by one God. Right? That's the only
Yeah.
difference. Like everybody else, 200 gods they're
Yeah.
arguing about.
But
We're just letting go of one.
If I can go over by about a minute, there was also a moment in college where I went dressed as a weird fortune teller, Mrs. Roper looking thing, because I had a caftan and some beads. And I recognized a guy at the party, and he was a guy who drunkenly had hit on my friend Jeannie like 3 weeks earlier. And he made some snide, drunken remark to her saying, it would never work anyway, my mom's name is Jeannie, and that would be weird yelling out in bed, you know. And so at this party 3 weeks later, I'm talking to him as my Halloween persona, and I give him a rock to pick out. He picks out the white rock, because I was giving away stupid little gemstones as a gimmick thing. And I said, you've chosen the white rock. That's innocence. I see you as a small child in the kitchen with your mother. Her name is Jeannie. And this frat brother unraveled before me. And spent the next hour asking everybody at the party if they knew what his mother's name was, and nobody did. Not even my friend who he'd hit on. And he called his mother. I really want to know how that call went at like midnight on Halloween. And at the end of the night, I just said, you hit on my friend Jeannie 3 weeks ago. Be skeptical.
Oh, good. I
We
can't
can all
imagine a
agree.
better story to end on.
Skepticism is good, and fuck that guy. We can all agree.
2 F-bombs. Okay. So I do want to give just a second for a shameless plug.
A shameless plug.
Shameless plug.
You can. I'm doing a massive charity project for Doctors Without Borders right now. It's called Roll for Initiative. If you're into TTRPG gaming, which you probably are because you're here, you should check it out. It's a lot of fun, and we've raised like $17,500 so far.
Oh my God, that's one of my
to save
favorite
lives around the
charities.
world.
Yay.
Yeah, they're so cool.
Yep, that's one of my favorite charities. Curt.
I'm Curt, and I'm fortunate enough to be friends with these four.
Okay, Jamy.
7 o'clock, the Magic and Wonder show here in one of the ballrooms or whatever. Tomorrow night.
Tomorrow
Crystal
night.
Ballroom. Crystal
Yep,
Ballroom.
tomorrow night.
Crystal Ballroom with Curt and John Armstrong and myself.
Yep, Celestia.
I'm doing Art and Skepticism Sunday at 1 o'clock, and listen to Squaring the Strange. I make a lot of bad puns.
And she's moderating the next panel. So thank you so
All
much
right.
for joining us. Thanks, Mark. Sorry about the timer. Bye.